Good morning. I'm Ariel Rivers, NACD's Pacific Region Representative, and I will facilitate this 1-hour NACD Urban and Community Conservation webinar on the Iowa Watershed Approach. We will record this webinar and post it on NACD's website along with a PDF of the presentation for future access. Please share widely with your networks and anyone who may be interested in seeing this or previous presentations. You should be connected online to see the presentation, and you can access audio via your computer or by phone. Please check your confirmation email for additional details. All lines are muted except for the speakers. I'll open a chat area after the presentation so you can type in your questions and comments, and we'll address as many as we can. You may want to write down any questions to add to the chat box later. With the Adobe Connect system, slide transitions will take a few seconds, so please do not worry that it is your computer or connection. Now, Ron Rohal will provide a few introductory comments. Ron is chair of NACD's Urban and Community Resource Policy Group, which is part of our Natural Resources Policy Committee. Ron?
And good morning, and I welcome all of you to the monthly Urban and Community Conservation webinars offered by the National Association of Conservation Districts through the support of our sole sponsor, the Scotts Miracle-Gro Company. These sessions are designed by NACD's Urban and Community Resource Policy Group, a subcommittee of district officials and partners charged with guiding the association's services and support for districts' work in developed and developing areas. Our goal through these webinars is to help districts share what they are doing nationwide and enable them to learn from each other and various agencies and organizations. And we appreciate the support of the Scotts Miracle-Gro Foundation for making them possible. I invite you to let us know what you think about each webinar and what are the topics you would like us to cover by contacting NACD staff Ariel Rivers. And please tell your NACD leadership what type of assistance you would like from our National Association for your urban and community conservation work. And now I'll hand it over to Ariel for the introduction of our speakers.
Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome.
Today we have two speakers from the Iowa Watershed Approach Project at the Iowa Flood Center, which is part of the University of Iowa. Dr. Larry Weber is co-founder of the Iowa Flood Center and served as the director of IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering, for 13 years. He is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Iowa and is the project lead for the $97 million Iowa Watershed Approach Project. Joining him, we have Kate Giannini, who leads outreach, communication, and research activities for the IWA program at the Iowa Flood Center. She serves as liaison between IIHR researchers, IWA partners, and external stakeholders. Previously, she had worked nearly 10 years at the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District and is currently serving her third term as Soil Commissioner in Washington County, Iowa. Thank you both for offering to present today. Dr. Larry Weber, I will now hand it to you.
Great. Thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Ron, for hosting us today for this presentation. I'm waiting for my screen to catch up. There we go. As was mentioned in the introduction, my name is Larry Weber. I'm a faculty at the University of Iowa. At Iowa, we have one of the nation's oldest programs, academic research programs, focused on the study of fluid mechanics, river hydraulics, hydrology, and water resources. Some of the work that we do there is to support the Office of Naval Research in developing their naval surface combatants. We do a lot of fundamental laboratory research and numerical modeling, as well as field-based research like we'll describe today. The IIHR program has been around since 1920, so this year we celebrated our 100th anniversary. That program has regional, national, and world recognition for its work in fluid mechanics and hydraulics and hydrology. And interestingly, in 2008, much of eastern Iowa was impacted by a devastating flood. You may have heard of it. At the time, it was the fourth largest natural disaster in U.S. history. Unfortunately, it's been surpassed by numerous storms since that time. But in 2008, this is a photograph of the Cedar River in Cedar Rapids, and you can barely make out the street crossings across the river and the city administrative buildings that were located on an island within the river. So a tremendously devastating event. 30,000 people displaced from their homes overnight. 1,100 blocks of the city were inundated by floodwaters. In total, the disaster recovery costs have been well over $10 billion. And again, not just impacting Cedar Rapids, but much of eastern Iowa. Again, it impacted businesses and residential areas alike. At the time of the event, it was a long wave event. There was a forecast early in the week that the river would be rising based on upstream rainfall. As the week progressed, rainfall continued in Iowa, and the Weather Service forecast for the USGS gauge in Cedar Rapids continued to rise each and every day, going up 2 to 4 feet each and every day as the event unfolded. Unfortunately, people that lived in Cedar Rapids didn't have very good spatial information with respect to the extent of floods. When the Weather Service forecasted the river to crest at 20 feet or 22 feet, later 24 feet, and then 28 feet, and ultimately the river crest at 32 feet on Friday, June 13th, 2008, people were surprised at the expansive inundation in the city. So that led to legislators requesting a proposal from the University of Iowa, and more specifically from IHR, Hydroscience and Engineering, to create a state-funded program focused on flood preparedness, flood science, and flood resilience. Those legislators worked tirelessly in the 2009 legislative session to form the Iowa Flood Center as the nation's only academic research center focused solely on floods. So we've been in operation or existence for a little over 10 years. We began by deploying sensors throughout the watershed and using those sensors to help in forecasting and developing an information system. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a project or a program that we call the Iowa Watershed Approach. And this is really working with Iowans both in urban areas as well as rural watersheds. The map on the right shows the 3 communities, Dubuque, Coralville, and Storm Lake, where we'll spend about $40 million on urban infrastructure and a Healthy Homes initiative in Dubuque. And the blue watersheds are 8 watersheds across the state of Iowa, where we will also spend about $40 million on rural conservation practices to reduce flooding during heavy rainfall and improve water quality year-round. So this project came out of a 5-year program that we had funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2010 to 2016 that we called the Iowa Watershed Project. It focused on 4 watersheds in Iowa. In 2010, HUD had announced that in reviewing the disaster recovery year from 2008, they had $312 million of supplemental funding. Of that $312 million, $84.1 million, which was later increased to $92 million, were appropriated to the state of Iowa because of the leadership and innovation shown in flood recovery in the 2008 disaster year. Of that $84 million, $10 million was allocated towards a watershed demonstration projects, with $8.8 million set aside for the Iowa Watershed Project that was overseen by the Flood Center. Additionally, we had $800K that was used to establish the first watershed management authorities in Iowa, and our partners, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, led that wonderful effort of establishing those first 6 WMAs and providing some funding to them to begin watershed planning for their watersheds. Within that first Iowa Watershed Project, we did a program and included the Soap and Chequest Creek watersheds down in southern Iowa. And interestingly, the Soap Creek watershed had established a watershed board back in 1986 through an intergovernmental 2080 agreement. In 1988, they had conducted a watershed study of the Soap Creek watershed and identified 154 locations where they could build distributed water holding projects, more simply farm ponds, that could hold water back during heavy rainfall and reduce flooding downstream. But they had never done a comprehensive study to determine or to try to quantify the benefit of those projects. 132 of the 154 had been built by 2012. Our project funded by HUD had come along, and so we developed a mathematical model where we could include the projects or we could exclude the projects and simulate rainfall over the watershed, and determined that those 132 projects in that Huck 10 watershed would provide roughly a 40% reduction in stream flow at the outlet of the watershed for a 100-year rainfall event. About 7.5 inches in a 24-hour period with a stream flow peak reduction of roughly 40%. And so we use that as a guide for our remaining watersheds in the original 5-year program. And as that project, the Iowa Watershed Project, was ending in 2016, HUD had joined forces with the Rockefeller Foundation and created the National Disaster Resilience Competition. That program provided $1 billion of community development block grant funds that was inspired or initiated following Superstorm Sandy on the East Coast. Of the applicants for that program, the state of Iowa received the 4th largest grant, totaling $96,887,077. The city of New York, Virginia, and Louisiana received the top 3 awards in the program. Of course, New York and Virginia having directly been impacted by Superstorm Sandy, and Louisiana impacted by nearly every Gulf tropical storm that makes landfall along the Gulf Coast. So we are very proud to receive that funding. The program, as it shows, began in 2016, and so we've begun our 5th and final year. The project will end in 2021 at the end of the calendar year. So we began, like we did in the Iowa Watershed Project, which the original program is shown here in the kind of salmon-colored watersheds, those 4, the Turkey, the Upper Cedar, Middle Raccoon, and Soap and Chequest Creeks. We selected the Upper Iowa, the Upper Wapsie, the Middle Cedar, Clear Creek, the English River, the North Raccoon, and East and West Nishnabotna for this program. We began by establishing a watershed management authority. As I mentioned before, those 28E intergovernmental agreements that include cities, counties, and soil and water conservation district offices. Our team develops a hydrologic assessment and a watershed plan, which becomes a guidance document for the watershed leaders for the next 20 years. We deploy monitoring equipment to be able to monitor the current conditions in the watershed. That includes soil moisture, soil temperature, rainfall, stream flow, and water quality, amongst other things. We work with project coordinators and volunteer landowners to implement projects that reduce the magnitude of flooding during heavy rainfall and improve water quality year-round. Coordinators have been key to this program since the beginning. They are the individuals that wake up every day with an effort to make the watershed a better place. And then, again, through our technical resources, we will provide a quantitative assessment at the end of the program, quantifying the benefits of both stream flow reduction as well as water quality improvement. That'll be based in part on the sensors that have been deployed early in the program, but because of the variability in rainfall and hydrologic conditions year over year, we simply won't have enough duration of data to rely only on the sensors. And so we use mathematical models to be able to provide those estimates, which I'll describe a bit in a few minutes. So our program in 8 watersheds, we focus on watersheds that are no larger than a hydrologic unit code 8 in size. And so the Nishnabotnas in southwest Iowa and the North Raccoon, the Middle Cedar and the Upper Wapsie and the Upper Iowa are all at that Huck 8 scale. The Clear Creek and English River watersheds are slightly smaller watersheds. But even at those small scales, and especially at the larger scales, if we took the resources, the fiscal resources we have to build conservation practices, and we allowed open enrollment across the entire watershed, the measurable benefit at the downstream end of these Huck 8 watersheds would be nearly zero. So we work with our watershed management authorities and the watershed coordinators to identify important watersheds at smaller scales, at Huck 12 scales. And in the middle cedar, you can see about 8 to 10 of those Huck 12 scale watersheds highlighted in yellow. And our attempt is to spend about $1 to $1.5 million of conservation practices in each one of those small Huck 12 watersheds. If we do that intensity of work, we anticipate about a 20% reduction in stream flow during a 50-year rainfall event. And so by focusing on those small watersheds, important watersheds to those water districts, we think that we can use those as examples that show what good looks like, what best practices can result in, and hope that the Watershed Management Authority would be able to continue this work well beyond the 5-year funded program funded by the National Disaster Resilience Competition. So our watershed management, one of the real positive outcomes when we got started in this program, you can see the WMAs that existed at the time of the start of the program. We had about 15 in Iowa. As we were about a year ago, that's now up to 26. I know that a couple more have been formed since then. We're approaching about 40% of the state being covered by a watershed management authority. My hope would be that in some not too distant future, we would have all of Iowa as part of a watershed management authority. I talked a little bit about our hydrologic assessment. This is sort of the planning approach that we have in the Iowa Watershed Approach Project. We begin with a hydrologic assessment. Of course, that information feeds into a watershed plan. Hydrologic assessment studies, past and present and future conditions of the water resources within the watershed. That folds into the watershed plan that looks at agricultural practices and community practices across the watershed and proposes scenarios for future watershed condition, changes to conservation practices within the farming system, changes to how stormwater is managed in small communities. We also have a team that's working on a resilience action plan or flood resilience action plan so that the communities and the rural residents can rebuild and reimagine their watershed following the ongoing natural disasters and flood disasters we have in Iowa. All of these elements feed into hazard mitigation plans and disaster recovery planning. Are vital to the counties and communities to have those plans in place so that they are eligible for federal assistance following natural disasters. So we begin with some fairly technical work in Iowa. The state of Iowa provided funding through a number of state agencies and through a partnership with Iowa State University and the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, Iowa Ag and Land Stewardship, and others in Iowa, a statewide effort was completed to assess through aerial photogrammetry and highly resolved LiDAR digital elevation maps, where all the best management practices that can be either seen through an aerial image or through a LiDAR data set could be mapped out. And those inventory of BMPs were geospatially located in Iowa, so we know the location of all of them, and then could be summarized in Huck 12s and Huck 8s across the state. And so this map shows all of the Huck 8s that we have, the magenta shaded watersheds, about 54 in Iowa, as I recall. And the smaller watersheds, the Huck 12s, we have about 1,600 of those in Iowa. So we have all the BMPs mapped across the state. This is an image that shows the hill shading that we get from LiDAR data. And on the left panel, you can see some agricultural fields that have adopted terraces as a conservation practice to hold soils in the fields during erosion events. And in the right panel, you can see a small farm pond with the dam and the red boundary showing the bounded extents of the inundated pool area. The drainage coming in is a relatively small drainage in this case, and then a small stream with a somewhat incised channel downstream. So just as an example of things that we can see through the LiDAR data, through aerial imagery, we can identify contour buffer strips and grassed waterways throughout the watershed, and those can be accumulated as well. Now, to counter or to balance what's on the field, we also employed the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework model, which relies on soils information and aerial photogrammetry and LiDAR data to cite best management practices throughout agricultural watersheds. And we've used that to determine the best locations for grassed waterways. And in the right panel, you see the model output that shows identifies potential locations for grassed waterways. In the left panel, you see that we have the existing grassed waterways identified, and we can overlap those two and then recognize that we don't have to approach farmers or landowners where they've already adopted those practices. We then use that information. We developed a very detailed hydrologic model. This is a best-in-class in the world type of model. It's a surface water groundwater couple model. It's a mass conserving model. It's a continuous model. And so we run this model based on all available land information, soils information, land use, land cover information, subsurface information about the soils and the bedrock, depth to the impermeable saturated zones. We take that information and then we drive the model based on radar-based rainfall. And we have rainfall based on radar estimates that go back to the early 2000s. So we can run simulations that begin in about 2000 and run up to the present day. And in Iowa, it's difficult, but we run that continuously, winter, spring, summer, and fall. We validate the model against USGS stream gauge data, and we use that model then to place these conservation practices that range from farm ponds to large wetlands to reconnected floodplains to soil health practices throughout the watershed. And we run the simulations based on the last 20 years of rainfall. We then add the conservation practices. We can rerun the simulations for that same period and quantify the benefit of the reduction. So this is an example of how the model runs, or the model looks. In the far upper right-hand corner, you can see the stream network in blue, some watershed boundaries in black. You can see the triangular mesh that's used here. And in this watershed, where we're modeling the entire Cedar River flowing to Cedar Rapids, you can see that we have about 28,000 triangles. So the minimum area is about 6 acres. The maximum area is about 250 acres, with an average area of about 160 acres. So about a quarter section of land is the average area. The red dots indicate locations where we have rainfall. We have a gridded rainfall that is, as I said, used to drive the model. So we have a fairly detailed gridded rainfall product that we use as well. We can calibrate the model. We do that based on monthly water balances. We do that based on simulated peak flows, and we do that by interrogating hydrographs. And so on the right panel, you see red line indicates the USGS stream gauge information. The blue line, which is in the background, indicates the model output. And we feel very comfortable that we've calibrated this model, again, across all seasons with dry antecedent soil moisture conditions and wet antecedent soil moisture conditions, and across all ranges within that 20-year hydrologic period that we're simulating. We can use that model then to look at things like runoff coefficient and determine watersheds that produce greater runoff during intense rainfall, and then use that strategically to prioritize those watersheds that have greater runoff production for the adoption of conservation practices. Speaking of which, we use standard NRCS designs for most of our small ponds. This map shows the distribution of 684 farm ponds that we've distributed across the watershed, and the main part of the middle Cedar flows down through the valley here. The farm ponds that we locate are typically in the upper part of small subbasins and small tributaries that drain to the main river. But every place we hold water back provides a benefit to the downstream Cedar Rapids community, of nearly 250,000 people. We've identified index locations on this map, 1 through 12, that we can extract data with the projects and without the projects, again, to see the benefit of those distributed storages throughout the watershed. We also look at the impact of climate change. We use the latest climate assessment report, the National Climate Assessment Report, that describes in our area, in Iowa, that by mid-century, under a low emission condition, we're going to see about a 10% increase in the 5% rainiest days. And under higher emissions conditions and toward the latter part of the century, that can be as high as a 20% increase in the 5% rainiest days. And so we have 20 years of rainfall data. We go through and we assemble that data. We look at the 5% rainiest days, and those might be days when we had 7 inches of rain. And we increase that by 10%, so that then becomes a 7.7 inch rain. We rerun the model, and we see the impact. Now, you all know that, when we have large rainfall events in the 5 to 7 inch range, every droplet of additional rainfall on top of that wet and heavy rain is almost 100% runoff. So oftentimes we see the intensification of rainfall leading to greater and greater episodic flooding events. And I think that's been seen here in Iowa and seen over much of the country over the last couple of years. So we can take those index points and we can look at the benefits under the current conditions. We'll rank the annual peak flood. In this case, we then add 100% native vegetation across the watershed. And again, we do that recognizing that we're not going to be able to convert all ag land back to native vegetation, but it does provide, a limiting condition for the benefit of conservation on the land. We then add the increased rainfall through climate change. That's the open circles here. So we have a blue symbol, the current conditions. The green symbols are with 100% native vegetation. Then as we add climate change back in, of course, the benefit of the 100% native vegetation is reduced slightly. Likewise, we know that cover crops and soil health initiative, increasing the soil organic content and increasing the infiltration are very helpful. And so you also see from that same index point, site number 2, current conditions are the same in blue, with 100% adoption of cover crops and a soil health initiative. We can reduce the peak flood events each year and reduce them to such an effect that even with climate change, we still have a benefit based on current conditions. And then lastly, we have our distributed storages. These are 684 ponds with a 20 acre-feet flood storage in them. And you see that we do see a benefit based on current conditions, but a benefit that only, in some cases, persists, after we add the increased precipitation with climate change. So we can look at that at Cedar Rapids. We can look at that in the small watershed. And here we've just basically are showing that an area of 100% native vegetation at the largest scale at the Cedar River and Cedar Rapids provides about a 30-inch reduction, which can be very meaningful, nearly 3 feet of stage reduction in Cedar Rapids, and then with cover crops a bit less, and with ponds a bit less, and then less or so with climate change as we go forward. And of course, we can do all sorts of combinations of vegetation, cover crops, and ponds to try to optimize the scenarios. The great thing about the program is we have farmers and scientists and researchers working with elected and public officials using real-time data to make informed decisions. And oftentimes, as I'm speaking across Iowa, you know, some of the things that we work on here related to water quality are difficult conversations to have in rural Iowa. And the point that I make is I don't have an urban agenda, we don't have a rural agenda, but we do have a science agenda. And we do recognize that flooding is devastating to our state, and we've got to rely on good scientific data to help design a better future for Iowa. The program offers 90% cost share. As we originally launched the program back in 2016, we were hoping for a much lower cost share agreement. Of course, commodity prices have softened throughout much of the agricultural United States, and so we raised our cost share to 90% at the start of the program. We currently have a little over 1,000 projects that are sited, under design, completed, in construction, or awaiting construction. We've got $30 million, you know, actively allocated in the program, and all $40 million of the conservation dollars have been assigned and ready to be deployed. Work is underway. We had a tough year last year with a very wet fall and wet spring. Conditions are much drier this fall, allowing us to get work done as we go into this winter season. And this is one of the really nice wetland complexes. Happens to be right along a major interstate in Iowa, so there's a very nice sort of public exposure to this wetland complex. Very delighted that this project will hold waters back during heavy rainfall and process nutrients throughout the year. So really excited to see that project completed and watered up and functioning as expected. So I'm going to pause for a few minutes and let Kate speak for a few minutes on some of our flood resilience work, and so I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thanks, Larry. So I really want to just have a few slides to touch on about the flood resilience side of this program. And there's really two parts of the IWA project. So we have our flood mitigation side, where it's very technical that Larry explained, and we're working with voluntary landowners to install these conservation practices like wetlands and ponds and terraces on the landscape. The other part of this program is flood resilience, and we know that IWA has to do with building resilience not only on a physical context but socially. And we know that making investments of conservation practices and natural infrastructure on the landscape, that we can build watershed resilience. But what about our communities? So how do we bring these essential partners and key decision makers to the table to build a more resilient community? And through IWA, we did this in a few different ways, and I hope I can provide an example. I'll share a few examples with you today, and really we are hoping that these could be future frameworks for others to use in their situations as well. So we define flood resilience as the ability of a community within a watershed to plan and act using local capacities to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from a flood. And this really takes into account several resources and partners and their expertise to develop an effective long-term plan and strategies. One of the goals that Larry touched on of this program that we have seen actually be successful out west with wildfire planning is that we would like to emulate here in Iowa, but more in a water context, is that the marrying of hazard mitigation planning with watershed management plans. We learned a lot through this process in the past 4 years, and it had a lot of challenges and successes as well. And our hopes are to develop a successful FEMA grant proposal that addresses conservation infrastructure at the watershed scale. This is not typical of current FEMA funding investments, and this really opens up another funding source for conservation to build resiliency for our downstream communities. We're currently working with a staff member from the Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management Department with hopes to submit a proposal for a multi-jurisdictional FEMA application later this year. And multi-jurisdictional is we're just talking about a county organization and a city partnering together, identifying areas within their watershed to work with volunteer landowners to install conservation practices that provide flood storage capacity. Within a few of the IWA watersheds, we are also working with smaller communities to develop a community flood resilience action plan. The communities that were selected had past flood events that were devastating to their towns, and they likely wouldn't have had funding sources or staff capacity to take on this type of project. Instead of our group from the university coming in and running the project, we contracted with local community organizations like resource conservation and development groups or local planning consultants to develop that flood resilience action plan. These organizations already had that trusted relationship with their community, and we likely would have been seen as outsiders, and we know, working with farmers in the past, we know how long it takes to build trust, especially when you're doing any type of outreach and planning efforts. I'm going to showcase a few of these community-level programs that we implemented. We worked with the Iowa Valley RC&D with the city of Vinton, which the city of Vinton is about a population of about 5,000. They had a history of repetitive flooding, and that created hard economic and social hardships, and they were part of 2 major disaster declarations. The Iowa Valley RC&D conducted community engagement. They facilitated public conversations, and they also collected and analyzed stories, flood stories, and information related to flooding, especially when it came to low to moderate income residents. They held key interviews with decision makers in the community. They did doorstep and phone interviews with residents. They created a website, which you see here on the slide, and held 3 in-person community conversations. One of those community workshops was a flood resilience tournament. They contracted with a local planning organization, JEO Consulting, and they came in and they modified this flood resilience tournament, which is a role-playing game, and residents and people that were participating in this workshop would assume roles of decision makers or different roles within a community and act out how they would respond during a flood event and with limited resources. They had a great turnout for this event, and media came and also put a story in their local newspaper. This project has been wrapped up, and you can review the final report at the Flood Resilient Vinton website or our IWA website as well. Another example is we worked with the community of Coralville. We contracted with Stieg Planning and conducted kind of similar activities to Vinton with a stronger emphasis on socially vulnerable populations, and they connected with a lot of their stakeholders through hunger relief agencies. Additionally, these efforts had to be modified because of COVID, and much of the outreach that was going to be taking place in person had to go to a virtual format, and they did have some success with that. The team also created a GIS database of interviews and information that they were gathering, and they created a business and nonprofit pledge campaign to bring those organizations together in future times of crisis. And all details about this project can also be found under their website, and the final plan is set to be delivered this December.
And the last project I wanted to highlight was the City of Dubuque and their B Branch Healthy Homes program and their Watershed program. The City of Dubuque was an extraordinary partner in development of this IWA proposal. Many of the residents had experienced flash flooding in this area, and in the past 20 years they have had experienced 6 presidential disaster declarations, which resulted in a lot of structural issues with homes in this area and public health concerns with the chronic mold and mildew within their homes. The funds were awarded to properties within this watershed to low to moderate income residents to make repairs and implement on-site stormwater management practices to decrease the environmental health and safety issues. And the program is part of a larger watershed effort. This creek actually used to be underground in a storm sewer conveyance, so in a pipe. In 2004, the City Council voted to delight the creek and restore it to its natural state. They went through extensive citizen input session and developed a creek corridor concept. And you see from a picture here that much of that construction has happened, and the B Branch is now been daylighted, and they created quite the amazing corridor and green space along that area. Since that upgrade, a lot of the residents and businesses have seen property values increase substantially. And a large part of my position at the Iowa Flood Center is conducting outreach and communication for the IWA project, and we do that in several different ways. And we have a website, our newsletters, we put out annual story maps. We work with our project coordinators and partners to host media and field days, and we are also very active on social media, and we attend as many conferences that we can, webinars such as today, and we are often connecting with other agencies throughout the Midwest and nationwide to kind of build and tell the story about the framework of the IWA project. Larry, I was going to have you take over from here.
Great, thanks, Kate, and again, thanks for sharing the resilient side of the story with our participants today. Our partnerships, just cannot be overstated. It has been an amazing journey for us through the first 5-year Iowa Watershed project, and that continues on with the Iowa Watershed Approach project. This is an image from our North Raccoon Watershed meeting, in which a tremendous amount of time was spent in developing their watershed plan. Again, you see commodity groups and conservation groups represented here, local, state, and federal government staff and officials, residents of the watershed, Watershed Management Authority leaders. It's just been a fantastic opportunity for people to come together. And certainly, our experience has been that although nobody likes to be told what to do from Washington, D.C. or from, our state capital in Des Moines, when they work together at the watershed scale, it really is one watershed and one set of shared goals going forward. As I think was mentioned earlier, or at least as we were chatting before the program started, the Iowa Watershed Approach Project, when it was awarded by HUD back in 2016, was recognized in HUD's letter of award as a very unique program, one that does work at larger scales out in these rural watersheds. And since that time, we have had the fantastic opportunity to host people interested in watershed work across the country. Most notably, in August of 2019, we hosted 20 or 25 people from North Carolina. Again, elected officials, soil and water conservation specialists, folks from the North Carolina Farm Bureau, conservation groups, on and on and on. Came up and spent 3 days with us in Iowa. We toured through rural watershed programs as well as the city of Cedar Rapids, and built these long-lasting collaborations and relationships. And We were hoping to join them in March of this year for a visit to North Carolina. That was just as the COVID pandemic was starting to express itself across the country. And so in a conservative approach, we decided to cancel the trip. But we do hope to reciprocate that visit sometime next year. So very excited about that as an opportunity. Likewise, in January of 2020, we hosted about 32 people from Texas. Texas, of course, is impacted by so many landfall and Gulf tropical storms, and Hurricane Hugo most recently impacted southeast Texas and devastated that area. Texas has assembled a large program to implement flood resilience practices across the state. They had heard of the Iowa Watershed Approach Project and the Iowa Flood Center, and so sent about 30 people to Iowa the first week of January. And we joke about it because when folks from Texas come to Iowa in January, we know they must be serious. And we had a wonderful opportunity to spend a couple days with them and, again, continue to do some work in Texas. Not shown by slide, but also Louisiana. And the Louisiana Watershed Initiative was most certainly informed by many of the strategies that we deployed in the Iowa Watershed Approach Project. And more recently, we're working with folks in Missouri to, again, deploy a Missouri Water Information System. So excited to partner with them and others from across the country. Within the state, we have academic partners in both public and private institutions, communities and counties, and resource conservation and development groups, soil and water conservation commissions, county conservation boards, cities, state, regional, and federal partners. And this only just shows just a few logos of folks that we partner with across the program. As I started, the Flood Center and the Iowa Watershed Approach Project are at the university, or our portion of it is at the University of Iowa within the IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering program. And I know that Kate and I would both be delighted to take any questions from the online participants today.
All right, excellent. Thank you both for your presentations. So we will now take questions for both Larry and Kate in the remaining time available. The chat area is open on the left side of your screen. Please feel free to type any questions you may have, and I'll read those aloud to our speakers so that we can capture them in the recording. So while we wait for any potential questions from the audiences, Larry and Kate, thank you again for such a wonderful presentation and the emphasis on science and the planning and implementation of these projects. For others who may not have necessarily the capacity or the resources that you may have at IWA, do you have any suggestions for starting small to implement these community approaches to resiliency?
Yeah, I think it is, one of the things that I probably didn't express enough is that the watershed management authorities, again, which include city and county and soil and water conservation district representation, as well as community members at large, have done a wonderful job in Iowa. Some have been part of our programs where we've been able to provide federal resources for the project implementation. Others have not, but they've been able to, for the most part, scrap together funds to get watershed plans completed, to work actively to write grants for implementation. But the WMA structure has worked very well in Iowa.
Excellent. Kate, do you have any additional comments that you would care to share?
Yeah, that was my first thought too, is that the watershed management authorities organizing a smaller collective group across those political boundaries to work together towards those common goals, that is a great place to start. So the counties, districts, and the cities that work together, 28E agreement to just saying that they can work together. And they leverage different funding sources through grants to seek out solutions for their watershed together. And authority might have not been a very good word choice when we first created these in 2010 when the legislators created the authorities, they really have no authority, and that can scare away rural landowners and urban as well. And much of the watershed management authorities have changed their names and their bylaws to be coalitions to better represent how they're collaborating together. They don't have any taxing authority, and it's really just a way for these groups to work together.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from the audience now. Are dams more effective than detention ponds for larger sites, say over 3 acres, or do you use them in tandem with ponds regardless of size?
Yeah, let me try to answer that question. I'm maybe just slightly confused on the differentiation between dams and ponds, but you know, our largest projects are farm ponds that may have a surface area, you know, in the 20 acres or slightly above. Some of the wetlands are larger than that, but of course there's not much water storage behind, or as much water storage behind the wetlands. So, you know, we're focused on projects that would be classified as low hazard, you know, projects for the most part, because, you know, even though we had $40 million for conservation practices, and we want to get that distributed across the land, we do focus on, you know, projects that are in that, you know, 5 to 10 to 15 acres in terms of surface water area. Larger projects, if we got to larger flood mitigation, like we think of as a federal, you know, flood control system, we could easily spend $40 million or $400 million on a single project. So we do focus on kind of small distributed rural projects. And again, all of the projects remain private, so they're still privately owned by the landowner. There's no public access to them unless, you know, the landowner chooses to allow the public to it. But in doing so, those landowners want something as well, so they want to be able to fish it or swim it, or, you know, have the grandkids down and paddle around and play in the small ponds.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry. That was very helpful. And sort of a follow-up comment to that, the question was curious about urban areas. So I don't know if you have any additional comments that might be relevant in an urban context instead of a rural landowner context.
Yeah, so certainly we do work with communities as well, and so we want to be able to put you know, conservation practices of communities. Most of the watersheds that were selected in this round of our work have been mostly rural with a few small communities. In those small communities, then we do have some dry storages or stormwater detention basins. Of course, you know, being a dry storage, you know, every cubic foot behind, you know, the dam then can be used for flood mitigation. So they have some slight advantage there. So yeah, we go from, you know, dry stormwater detention basins to, you know, these rural ponds. Where we can on the farm ponds, we do like to increase the elevation difference between the primary piped outlet and the emergency overflow spillway to allow some additional flood storage, where the, you know, topography and the landowner would make that allowable.
Excellent, thank you. And we have a comment as well from one of our staff members at NACD, Candace Adenati, who's our Southeast Region representative. She mentioned that for districts that are engaged in local hazard mitigation planning process, FEMA actually has a current funding opportunity open for $660 million in hazard mitigation funding, and projects focused on nature-based solutions are encouraged. And she provides a link in the chat box as well. So Larry and Kate, you mentioned that you're also looking into FEMA grants. So I don't know if you have any additional comments or suggestions for districts that might want to look into such projects.
Yeah,
well,
so that's
you know, again,
go ahead, Larry.
Kate.
Oh, that is a similar grant proposal. I think it's the same one, the FEMA BRIC application proposal that we are working with local staff from our Homeland Security Emergency Management to put that together. So we're looking at nature-based solutions within a smaller Hub 12 watershed and that Middle Cedar watershed, and to submit a proposal with the county and the city working together.
Excellent. And do you have any additional comments, Larry?
Yeah, just one other thing, you know, is that, I think we're going to see more and more opportunities along these lines. HUD has paid a very careful eye to Iowa to see how our program is working. And, we're overcoming some challenges. And one of the challenges always in nature-based solutions is how do we quantify the benefit? And how far downstream are we allowed to accept, quantification of the benefit? And so, that gets to be, complicated fairly quickly. And so I think through our project, we're helping, to guide, FEMA and HUD on looking at cost-benefit ratios in the future. But certainly these nature-based solutions, I think, are going to become more and more prevalent.
Excellent, thank you. And I just want to remind everyone as well that one of the objectives of this project is sharing the results widely, as both Larry and Kate touched on. And so the contact information for both of our speakers are on the screen. So I encourage you to reach out to them and ask any follow-up questions that you may have, especially about their various approaches. And so with that, we are just about out of time. So I thank our speakers again for sharing their information and expertise. And I'll send the link of the recording on NACD's website to everyone soon. So before we close, just a few reminders. Be sure to check out NACD's Urban and Community Conservation webpage, which features information on urban projects, backyard conservation, and links to past webinars. Please also make sure to sign up for our publications if you have not already received to receive all the latest news on Conservation District and partner activities. And remember to also register for next month's webinar, which will highlight Oklahoma's Yard by Yard Community Resilience Project, which celebrates urban individuals who adopt earth-friendly conservation practices. So again, thank you, Larry and Kate, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.